I recently did a bunch of videos on Phase 1 of Star Wars because the end of the Skywalker saga felt like a good time to look back at the last 5 years of Star Wars content. I want to keep that going, and today I'm going to talk about my top 10 new canon stories. I'm not including the movies in this, instead I'm focusing on the TV shows, the books, the comics, and the video games, and more. I assume everyone has seen the movies, and I want to try to encourage people to check out some of those other stories if they never have. I'll kick things off at number 10 with a comic, Kanan the Last Padawan by Greg Weisman. This was a fairly short series, coming in at only 12 issues, but it does have one of my favorite Star Wars moments in it. For the first half of the story or so, Kanan is being hunted by two clones that he used to consider friends. When they finally catch him, Kanan is able to break through to one of them, and that clone realizes what he had done. He kind of breaks the spell of Order 66 and recognizes what he and his clones had done to the Jedi, and so he makes it right by sacrificing his life to let Kanan go. And it was such an emotional and moving moment that I wasn't expecting. It hit me out of nowhere, and that scene alone earns the Kanan comic a spot on this list. For number 9, we'll move over to a book, Thrawn by Timothy Zahn. Like a lot of people, the original Thrawn trilogy was one of my first Star Wars books, so I have a lot of fond memories of the Grand Admiral. I was thrilled when they brought him into Star Wars Rebels, and I think they did a pretty good job of doing the character justice, but man, did this book take me back. It felt like a perfect summary of who he was. It felt like a perfect summary of who he was. I think Star Wars Rebels really nailed his character in one episode, but Thrawn is always going to be a book character first for me, and having Zahn back to write him just felt good. Not only that, but this story didn't really overwrite anything from Thrawn's Legends history. It felt like it would have worked just as well in either universe. This is probably mostly a nostalgia pick on my part, but whatever. I had a blast reading it. Moving on to number 8, I'm picking another book, Alphabet Squadron by Alexander Freed. I am a sucker for pilot stories. The old Legends X-Wing series are probably always going to be some of my favorite Star Wars books, so I was thrilled to hear that we were getting another pilot-centric story that we now know is going to be a trilogy. And fortunately, that first book was great. We get to meet 5 new characters coming together during a very tumultuous time in the galaxy. They all have their own motivations and problems and differences and difficulties coming together. I love that in The Force Awakens we get to see Finn and Poe become best friends over the course of like 2 minutes. Alphabet Squadron is not like that. These characters take a lot of time to warm up to each other and build trust, but it is no less compelling to see. Swapping back to comics, my 7th pick is Dr. Aphra by Kieran Gillen and Simon Spurrier. This series has been consistently, completely insane for its entire run, and that's probably my favorite thing about it. A lot of the new canon stories have been very connected with the Skywalker saga or the Clone Wars or just things that we already know. Dr. Aphra does take place during the Skywalker saga and does occasionally intersect with Darth Vader's story or Luke Skywalker's story, but for the most part it sticks to itself and does its own very weird thing. And that's refreshing to see when so many of the other books and comics and even movies feel so very safe. Dr. Aphra swings for the fences every single month, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but I love it for trying and for keeping me on my toes. For number 6, I'm going back to books, this time for Claudia Gray's Lost Stars. I know I just praised Dr. Aphra for doing something weird and getting away from the Skywalker saga, and Lost Stars doesn't do that at all. It is very firmly placed within the events of the original trilogy, but it follows the perspective of 2 background characters, people who technically would have been in all 3 movies. We get to see how people who aren't really involved in this endless fight between the light side and the dark side experience the same story, and it's really cool. Not to mention, the 2 characters are highly likable and they have like this Romeo and Juliet thing going on. I'm not much of a shipper, but I absolutely wanted these 2 characters to get together. Honestly, you can't go wrong with any Claudia Gray book. They're all wonderful, but Lost Stars is my favorite of the bunch, and it's also kind of a perfect entry point if you've never read a Star Wars book before, because it's a good way to kind of just ease yourself in. But back to comics for number 5, the Lando Miniseries by Charles Soule. This is the only comic miniseries on the list. It's only 5 issues long, but it does pack a heavy emotional punch. Lando, his buddy Lobot, and a handful of other criminals attempt to steal something from the Emperor, and it goes about as well as you would expect. Before this story, I thought Lobot was a fine and interesting background character. The little headband thing was cool, it had some nice flavor, but after this story, he is one of my favorites. We learn why he's a man of few words, and it is gut-wrenching. This series has been out for like 5 years now, and I still don't want to spoil it because I want people to experience this one for themselves. This is one of the first comics I recommend people read if they've never read a Star Wars comic before, because it is only 5 issues long. You can get through it really quickly, it's excellent, and then you can decide if you want to continue on with more Star Wars comics. But for number 4, it's the first TV series on the list, The Mandalorian. I don't think it's any surprise that the very first live-action Star Wars series would be included. And I've said this before, but The Mandalorian was just so much deeper than I was expecting it to be. And it's gotta be a crazy challenge to convey emotion when your main character has a mask on the entire time and he just refuses to take it off. But it works, and I also kinda love how heavily it leans on old samurai and western tropes, but because it's got a Star Wars spin on it, it never feels stale. I mean, I remember after Celebration thinking like, oh, if his bounty is like a kid that teaches him to love again, I'm gonna hate it. And then in the first episode, that's exactly what happens, but it's a Star Wars-y spin, it's a baby Yoda, and I've never been so happy to be wrong. The first season wasn't perfect, it had its ups and downs, but I never lost enthusiasm for the series. I couldn't wait for the next episode every week, and it began and ended so strongly that I can forgive any falters in the middle episodes. At number 3, I'm naming another series, Star Wars Rebels. This one means a lot to me personally because I was incredibly skeptical of it before I started watching it. I remember thinking like, oh, it looks too Disney, it looks too childish, I don't like the art style, like all of those things. But I gave it a shot because of this channel, and I was pretty quickly enthralled after only a few episodes. And then the series only gets better and better with episodes like Twilight of the Apprentice, Twin Suns, Jedi Knight, World Between Worlds. It's got some top-tier Star Wars storytelling that I feel is on par with the movies. It also struck a really great balance of telling personal stories with telling bigger, connected to the universe stories. I am so hoping that those rumors of a Rebels sequel series coming are true. My number 2 pick is the last comic on the list, Darth Vader by Charles Soule. I already appreciated Soule after the Lando comic and Obi-Wan and Anakin and Poe Dameron, but this was the comic that told us that Charles Soule is the Star Wars comic writer. I kinda rolled my eyes at the thought of another Darth Vader series happening when it was announced, but then every single issue was awesome. They all ended in like this bombshell cliffhanger that left me just demanding to read the next issue. Every arc is fantastic, and more importantly, while I was skeptical that there was more that we could learn about Anakin Skywalker, I was proven wrong. Especially the last issue is weird and important, but ends on like a hopeful note. Lando is the comic that I usually recommend people read first because it's so short, but honestly, if you've never ever read any Star Wars comic, like this is the one that'll probably hook you the best. And finally, for my top spot in the list is Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Even if I had included the movies in this list, Fallen Order would still take the top spot. I love The Force Awakens, but Fallen Order straight up blew me away. I've been singing its praises for months now, but just my first playthrough, I remember like the entire second half of the game, I was just sitting there playing with my mouth wide open. I love Cal, I love the second sister, I love Marin and BD-1, I love all the characters, and I love all of their arcs. I love what they're all dealing with, their struggles, their victories. It's got an exciting but hopeful story, and at times it's also sad and heartbreaking. The music is perfect. I adore what the game has to say about forging your own path, about looking back through all of the events of your life, both good and bad, accepting them both, and using them to become who you were meant to be. I love what it says about control and choice. Cal, Trilla, and Marin all had their choices taken away from them when they were young, and then they have to look to the future and decide whether or not it's right to do the same thing to another group of people. It has so much to say, and it all lines up with the other messages of Star Wars, and on top of that, it's a fun game. Like, oh yeah, it's also just a blast to play. But those are my top 10 new canon Star Wars stories. Everyone's got a different opinion on things like this, so let me know your top 5 or 10 or however many in the comments. If you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and consider checking out our Patreon page. As always, thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.